Lawmakers have passed a plan to help close the state's budget gap, though far from unanimously. Democrats had the votes to get this plan passed, and it did, but that does not reflect the consensus of Republicans. Still at the core, in many ways, lawmakers do not agree on how to close the budget gap or even on why it exists at all.
We've had a budget gap that opened up in the last few months, and we're going to close it. And we're going to close it in a way that's agreed to by the House and the Senate and the governor's office.
Albeit reluctantly, some would say. Though the Democrats' plan that includes $12 million in cuts from things like the state's film training program and fire prevention grants did pass, it did so without the support of Republican leaders who say more cuts are needed. Senate Minority Leader John McKinney says privatizing social services, the care for the sick and elderly, would save the state hundreds of millions of dollars, but Democrats won't do it.
We are repeating the same mistakes of the past. At the end of the day, the taxpayers in Connecticut are going to suffer most.
Not so, says Senate President Don Williams. He says the bill solves $116 million in revenue shortfall with a series of aggressive spending cuts and by delaying for 2 years a cut in the estate tax for Connecticut's wealthiest citizens. He says with its passage, the bill saves cities and towns from having state aid cut by more than $80 million.
By protecting families from local property taxes, we help them in these tough times. But in terms of balancing the budget, now that we have filled that revenue gap, the governor has to live within the means of her own budget. That's 2/3 of the deficit.
Democrats say the governor is responsible for $212 million of the $337 million gap because her own agencies are not cutting back as she said they would.
Her departments and bureaucracies have got to live within their budget.
But Republicans say it's time to stop blaming the governor and are praising late word tonight that the state workers union will restart talks with the governor on how to save on labor costs.
We need to go back to state employees and ask them to do more. That's what every family and business in the state of Connecticut is doing.
Here now to help us better understand what is going on with the budget, its problems, and its solutions, Senator Jonathan Harris and Senator Dan DiVasella, who've both been vocal about the budget gap with some ideas about how we can solve this. Let's start off simply, or not simply, but maybe at the beginning with your perspectives, which might be somewhat different on why the budget gap exists.
Well, there really are two issues with it. One is we are seeing a continued drop in revenue because of the recession. It is down approximately $200 million off of where we expected it to be when the budget was passed 2 months ago. The other issue is that some areas of spending actually are running higher than expected, again, mostly due to the recession. Lots of people are going on to Medicaid, food stamps. A lot of the entitlement programs that we have are getting a lot more demand than we originally anticipated. So with lower revenue and higher expenditures, hence the $400 million deficit.
That's a bad combo.
Yeah.
And Dan and I would agree on the revenue piece. It is getting worse, and actually 36 other states, 3/4 of all states, have shown this slide in revenue beyond the projections, which we were very conservative on to begin with. The thing that I guess we disagree on is the entitlement piece. There's about $20 million of entitlement expansion that actually contributes to the deficit. The lion's share is over $200 million that the governor, as the chief executive, one person as opposed to 187 of us, was given the authority under the budget to cut, and so far that hasn't been cut.
You dispute her authority or her responsibility? Or
no, just the interpretation of what's actually happened is the governor's actually cut within her own authority over $50 million already. They call them rescissions to the budget that she's already done. She has more authority that she's going to be using in the next couple of months. But she also proposed over $100 million of cuts that required the legislature's approval. And when that came to us, the majority Democrats said, no, we're not willing to make these cuts. Some of them were tough cuts. But when we say as a legislature, no, we're not going to make the cuts, it's up to you, Governor, and you alone to make them, we're kind of shirking our responsibility as the elected legislature.
What do you have to say about the cuts? Because I know that some people did think, and I guess it is due to interpretation, but the other day when we were there, it was $12 million in cuts. Do you think there was room to make more? Or
We've cut actually already an historic amount in the original budget. We cut more this week. We will be coming back and we'll make more cuts. It's not about cutting. We know we have to cut. We're in agreement with the Republicans and with the governor on that. The $200 million were what we call lapses, which the governor was supposed to actually cut from the budget we passed, one, and additional things that would bring in more revenue. A Medicaid waiver for Saga to bring in a match from the federal government to help on the deficit. That has not been done. As a matter of fact, we legislated that twice in the past 5 years. The governor has not done it. With respect to the cuts, we have to be thoughtful and strategic about cuts. We cannot pour gas on the fire. When you looked at the cuts that the governor proposed that Dan mentioned, a lot of them were very damaging. The $84 million of cuts to local aid would have pushed up property taxes in Norwalk and Darien in Dan's district. Not acceptable, because that's a horrible tax, horrible way to go. We estimated that about 6,000 jobs would have been lost. Private sector jobs. As a matter of fact, the Office of Fiscal Analysis, the nonpartisan office, said there'd be about almost 4,000 jobs lost. We can't do that. The governor's cut also threatened about $50 million coming in from the federal government, expanding the hole. And finally, the cuts were hitting the most vulnerable. All these are tough choices, and Dan's correct about that. 63% of her cuts hit children. We all know you throw a child off health care, then you, Dan and I as taxpayers, end up paying more in the very near future.
Do you agree that there are cuts that the governor said that she would make in her agencies that she has not made?
No, because actually what happened was, Jonathan referred to these lapses, which for folks watching out there are basically a number that the legislature says this is how much we're going to have left at the end of the year. In the budget that was passed, we doubled it over historical standards. So the legislature basically said to Governor Rao, we don't know how to do these spending cuts, you go figure it out, without ever specifying what they were. So they basically tried to set the governor up for a fall so that they can come back and say, well, you're not actually cutting spending, when in actuality she's the only one who is. And we can have an honest debate about this, because whether we want to cut spending, borrow, or raise taxes, those are the only three things we can do. But if you look at what the Democrats did this week, they basically said, we are going to raise taxes. They cut $12 million, which is a very small amount in a $18 billion budget. But then they said, okay, we are not going to do the sales tax cut that we originally said, lowering the sales tax from 6% to 5.5%, and we're not going to lower the estate tax by raising the exemption from $2 million to 3.5. So the only two tax cuts that were in the original budget that were passed, the Democrats say, we're not going to do those, instead of saying, let's get serious about cutting spending.
But in terms of that estate tax, by exempting the first $2 million, right? That's what it essentially did. I mean, aren't there some multimillionaires who are going to essentially get a tax cut because
75% of estates will get a tax cut under that. As a matter of fact, if you have a $2.1 million estate, under the old rules you were going to be paying well over $100,000. Now you're going to be paying about $8,000. So there already is a cut. With respect to the lapses, the governor's original budget, which was $2 billion not balanced, had lapses. The Republican budget, which was $600 million not balanced, had lapses. So do we. But the governor is the chief executive. She has the ability to go into the executive department, she's in charge of personnel, take a look at everybody, and we see a lot of middle management that can be cut, can be reorganized, can be streamlined. Dan and I in our subcommittee in appropriations, health and hospitals, we saw that in the Department of Public Health, and we said we're going to cut an additional $3 million off of the historic amount of cuts that subcommittee made, and said, Governor, figure out the way, because you know what you need to get the job done.
We only have about 1 minute left, but just to play devil's advocate, I mean, if you don't believe that she's done it until now, what makes you think that she's going to do the cuts that you think she should do now?
Well, the reality is that this is a time for solutions, not complaints. It's up to the Democrats, the Republicans, to sit down with the governor and figure out the way to get out of this without pouring gas on the fire, without job loss, without raising property taxes, without threatening federal dollars and putting us in a bigger hole, and making sure that the cuts, while they look like they improve the bottom line, don't just increase the burden on taxpayers in the next fiscal years. And we need to come together and do that.
All right. Well, you guys have a lot of work ahead of you, and we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Undoubtedly, this budget is going to give us lots to talk about in the months to come. Thanks again to Senator Jonathan Harris and Senator Dan DiBasella for taking time to be with us during this busy holiday week. Thanks a lot, guys.